Hello, my name is Carolyn Wheeler with the ASCD website team. Welcome to Classroom Instruction That Works, Creating the Environment for Learning with Howard Pitler. And now a brief introduction to our presenter. Howard Pitler is one of the co-authors of Classroom Instruction That Works, Second Edition, and Chief Program Officer at Mccrone, an education research and development company. As Chief Program Officer, Howard works with schools, districts, and state agencies to improve teacher pedagogy to impact student achievement. He is the lead author of Using Technology with Classroom Instruction That Works, and he's developed Mccrone's Power Walkthrough Informal Observation software. ASCD is pleased to welcome Howard Pitler.
And hello, everyone, and welcome. My name, as Carolyn said, is Howard Pitler, Chief Program Officer at Mccrone. We're going to talk today about creating the environment for learning and parts of Classroom Instruction That Works. Just briefly about Mccrone, our mission statement is to make a difference in the quality of education and learning for all through excellence in applied research, product development, and service. We really want to make a difference in the quality of education. That is our mission, and in order to do that, we need the help of every classroom teacher out there. Mccrone doesn't work directly with students, so we want our work to influence the work in the classroom, that way making a difference for all kids. Today's agenda will begin with an overview of Classroom Instruction That Works and what's different between the original book that came out in 2001 and the second edition, which just came out last year, the end of last year. And then we're going to talk about creating the environment for learning, specifically the strategies of setting objectives and providing feedback and how they play out in this new framework that we've developed. As we talk about creating the environment for learning, we want to start off by talking about two questions that students ask every day when they arrive in your school. Will I be accepted here, and can I do the work? And in creating an environment for learning, we want to help ensure that students can answer yes to both of these questions. We want students to believe that they will be accepted by both their teacher and their peers, and that they understand what the work is and feel confident that they're able to be successful in that task. So that's really what we'll be talking about today, building that environment in the classroom that helps students to answer yes to those two questions. In the agenda, I said we would talk about the differences between Classroom Instruction That Works and the second edition. And the biggest difference is right here on the screen. I know that many of you have read Classroom Instruction That Works first edition and are very familiar with this slide. In Classroom Instruction That Works, we looked at research on instructional strategies that make a difference in student achievement. And we grouped those strategies into 9 categories, which you see on the screen, and we talked about them by effect size and percentile gain. This chart is taken directly out of the first edition of Classroom Instruction That Works. What this caused a lot of practitioners to do, and to be really honest with you, I was a building principal in 2001, and I was one of the practitioners that did exactly this, is to look at this chart and say, well, if identifying similarities and differences is the category of strategies that has the highest effect size, that's where I'm going to start. And in my middle school at the time, we began book studies starting with identifying similarities and differences. As we looked at classroom instructional strategies and real teaching, it became very clear to us, as it did to everyone who already knew this in the field, that these strategies don't work in isolation. They support, each strategy supports other strategies, and teachers normally in daily practice weave these strategies together. In the second edition of Classroom Instruction That Works, we acknowledge that by the Mccrone Instructional Planning Framework. This is how we look at instruction based on literally thousands of observations in the classroom. And we look at the instructional strategies now grouped into three components. The first component is creating the environment for learning. So going back to that slide where we're asking students, or the two questions that students ask, will I be accepted here and can I do the work? That's where we address this, in creating that environment for learning. The strategies specific to this category of this component of the framework are setting objectives and providing feedback, reinforcing effort and providing recognition, and cooperative learning. And planning intentionally around these categories of strategies, teachers can really build a learning environment that helps students feel accepted, understand the work they're expected to do, and feel that they can, in fact, do that work. In future webinars, other authors from the book will talk about the other components of the framework. So once we've created that environment for learning, then we work on developing understanding. And there you see the strategies, cues, questions, advanced organizers, non-linguistic representation, summarizing and note-taking, and assigning homework and providing recognition. In addition to developing understanding, which is really that foundational knowledge that we want kids to have, we also have to focus on the blue square, extending and applying their knowledge. And that's where we see identifying similarities and differences and generating and testing hypotheses. So if I go back to the first edition of the book now, you see identifying similarities and differences as a category of strategies with the highest effect size, and where I acknowledged as a building principle I began my work with teachers. But if you look at our new instructional planning framework, you'll see that identifying similarities and differences really has impact after we've clearly defined our objectives, after we've built that foundational knowledge, and then we're having students involved in activities that really do, in fact, extend and apply knowledge, and in that way really getting to higher levels of student achievement. So you see that our intentional use of these strategies throughout lesson design helps understand how strategies support each other and how to go through an intentional planning process as you are looking at a lesson or a unit. In our session today, we're going to know the strategies for creating the learning environment. I want you to understand the classroom recommendations specific to setting objectives and providing feedback. I'm going to try to help make connections between and among the strategies. You'll see a consistency in this objective if you go through the other webinars with us through ASCD, because as we continue to grow the strategies through the framework, we'll be making connections, more and more connections between and among the strategies. And then I'm going to ask you at the end of the webinar to commit to try something that we brought to the table that you found new or different or possibly challenging in your classroom. If you're in the classroom, if you're working with teachers, then help them with the teachers that you work with to bring some change into your pedagogy in the next couple of weeks. One thing we know about professional development is you often hear really good ideas, but if you don't apply them, intentionally try to apply something you pick up in the next couple of weeks, the likelihood of you ever doing it is greatly diminished. Going back to the very first slide I showed, our mission at Mccrone is to make a difference in education. And so I'm going to ask you to help us at Mccrone by trying something from today's webinar in your classroom over the next 2 weeks. So we begin our journey today with creating the learning environment, creating the environment for learning. And I'll start off here with a non-linguistic representation of learning K-12. This road, this long road into the horizon, represents learning from the time we get our students at the beginning of our system until they move on either into the workforce or into higher ed or whatever the next level is. And as we begin a unit of instruction, it's important to clearly let students know where you expect them to go on this road. So you see this clump of trees on the right side of the road. We want to let our students know that this is where you're going. Here's where we're going. I use a sort of a mental image here often. When my two children were little, it wasn't uncommon for my wife or I to say to the kids, "Get in the car, we're going somewhere." And our kids would climb into the back seat of the car and they'd go somewhere with us. They didn't ask us, where are we going? What's the purpose of this trip? How will we know if this outing has been successful? They just got in the car and they went. Now, hopefully, my wife or I, we did answer those questions. Where are we going? Why are we going there? How will we know this trip has been successful? Too often in our classrooms, we tell our kids, get in the car. We need to be very clear with them, here's where we're going, and here's what we plan on learning, and here's how you know you've learned it. So, setting objectives. It's that process of letting kids know what you expect them to know, understand, and be able to do. We're going to start off with a poll here. In just a moment, we're going to activate a poll, and you're going to see truncated versions of these 4 questions. And I want you, and understand we have hundreds of people in this webinar, so you've got a great deal of anonymity right now. I'd like you to very honestly answer this question. When I set objectives with my students, I, 1, seldom identify the knowledge and skills students are expected to know within the objective. I occasionally design and use learning activities that are directly aligned with the objective. I consistently design and use learning activities that are directly aligned with the objective. And 4, I consistently design and use learning activities that are directly aligned with the learning objective, and my students can articulate the connection between the activity they are doing and the learning objective. And I'll ask Carolyn to activate the poll now, and please vote. I'm watching the votes coming in on my side. I see 70% of you have voted. We'll give you just a little bit longer. About another 4 seconds. Okay, Carolyn, if you could go ahead and close the poll and share the results out. You'll see, as the results come up on your screen, 1% said that you seldom identify the knowledge and skills. 17% occasionally design activities that are directly aligned. 64% consistently design activities and design and use learning activities directly aligned with the objective, and 18% consistently design learning activities that are aligned with the objective and your students can articulate. This actually is a row of a rubric from the Handbook for Classroom Instruction That Works. That book came out, I believe, in October or November of 2012. So if you don't have the second edition of the Handbook, I would encourage you to take a look at that, because we've built a rubric for every single recommendation in each of the strategies of classroom instruction that works. So teachers can begin to look at each strategy and what it would mean to be doing this at a proficient or an advanced level. The way we built these rubrics is a 3 on the rubric, and 64% of you say that you are at that level. A 3 on the rubric meets the classroom recommendations from Classroom Instruction That Works. A 4 on the rubric indicates you're meeting the classroom recommendation and your students are able to do something with it. Also in the Handbook for Classroom Instruction That Works, not only do we have rubrics for teachers, we have checklists for students. So if as a teacher you're wondering how your students perceive your use of setting objectives, there are a list of I think it's about a dozen questions connected with setting objectives. When my teacher does this, it helps me in some way. It's that type of a phrase. So take a look at the handbook, and it's really about implementing these strategies with fidelity. What does it mean from the teacher side, but also how do students use this information, and how does it help them? Setting objectives. The purpose is to give kids a clear direction for their learning and help students identify interests within the context of the lesson. Teacher, why do I need to know this? Well, if we help kids personalize the learning and give them that why do I need to know this answer, it really helps them. Our classroom recommendations, and I started off with our learning objectives for this session to understand what the classroom recommendations are. There are 4. Set learning objectives that are specific but not restrictive. Communicate the learning objectives to students and parents. Connect the learning to previous and future learning, and engage students in personal learning objectives. Very often, and part of my job here at Mccrone is to do classroom observations, and I've literally done thousands of classroom observations in the last year. And very often what I see written on the whiteboard are activities. They're very specific activities I will write a paper about. We need to make sure that the learning objective, they're specific, but they're not so restrictive as to be an activity or an event. We want to make sure kids can make that connection. So here you see from the Common Core Math 4.0a, and you see on the screen generate a number or shape pattern that follows a given rule, identify apparent features of the pattern that were not explicit in the rule. That, if phrased in student-friendly language for 4th graders, would be the objective. Right there in the box. Generate a number or shape pattern that follows a given rule and identify the apparent features of the pattern that were not explicit in the rule. Underneath that is an activity. And throughout the Common Core, you're generally going to see this. There's going to be the bigger picture, and then within that, some kinds of activities to implement those. Make sure that kids have both, not just the activity, but why we're doing it. When we do walkthroughs in classrooms, part of the protocol is to ask a random student, what are you learning? And very often, almost always, kids will reply by telling us what they're doing. I'm writing a paper, or I'm doing research about this. But then we follow it up with the next question. What do you think your teacher wants you to learn when you're doing that? And it's important that you, as the classroom teacher, make that connection. Here's what I want kids to learn when they're doing whatever it is that I have them doing. The second classroom recommendation was communicate the learning objectives to students. And we recommend in both Classroom Instruction That Works and the Handbook for Classroom Instruction That Works an iterative process that I have in a visual representation on the screen. Start off by posting the learning objective. We believe very strongly that you need to have the learning objective posted on the whiteboard or on the screen in your classroom, and it should be visible to students throughout instruction. It should be in student-friendly terms, and it should let kids know what you expect them to know, understand, and be not just the activity, but what it is they're learning. The objective can be enduring. You might have the same learning objective up in a class, in a math class, for a week or 10 days. And the activities under that will change every day. And they need to see that even though the activity today is different than the activity yesterday, both of these activities are in service to the same learning objective. I have teachers very often say, why do I need to write it on the board? I tell them, or it's on my first slide of my PowerPoint. Why do I need to write it up there as well? And I'll ask a few questions. When you tell students what they're going to be learning, is every student in the classroom? Is every student paying attention? Do you ever have late buses? Do you ever have kids going to the nurse's office or coming in late from the restroom? Of course you do. Also, do you ever have kids who sort of forget things? If you design a highly engaging activity, there's a good chance that the kids will get so involved in the activity that they'll forget what they're supposed to be learning. They'll get so involved in the science experiment that they're going to forget the content that you want them, or the principle or the idea that you want them to understand. So, post the learning objective, visible to students, student-friendly terms. And then give them just 30 seconds to turn to an elbow partner and explain what they think they're going to be learning. There's research out there, we use it in classroom instruction that works, and it's a much bigger piece on the importance of oral discourse, the importance of especially students who are developing language skills or second language learners of practicing oral vocabulary, orally, the academic vocabulary. So kids, here's what we're going to be learning. I want you to turn to your elbow partner and tell them what you think we're learning. Take 30 seconds of your class period to have them involved in that oral discourse. When possible, personalize the learning. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. And then, very importantly, during instruction, and especially at the end of instruction, revisit the learning. If you have a learning activity that is going to be a 20-minute, a 30-minute activity in the class, then make sure 10 or 15 minutes in, call sort of a timeout and say, kids, remember, here's what we're learning. Make sure that we keep them focused, so even though the activity is highly engaging and they're really doing that activity, focus them back in throughout the lesson on what they're supposed to be learning.
Howard,
another recommendation is to connect the learning objectives. Yes, go ahead,
I'm sorry,
Carolyn.
it's Carolyn.
Yes.
There's a question about what you were just talking about. How is the learning objective different from a learning target? Is the target more focused on the performance demonstration of the objective?
Thank you. That's a great question. We use the term learning objectives, learning targets, learning outcomes. Every district has a different name for it. It's that thing, that bigger idea that you want students to really be able to know, understand, and be able to demonstrate. We use the term learning objectives consistently throughout classroom instruction that works. A lot of districts that I work with use learning targets. I worked with a state that I don't remember what the acronym stood for. I think it was Tennessee. They have SLAs. It's whatever in your curriculum guide is identified as the big picture of the unit. I like to think about unit objectives because that's the bigger piece that we have a lot of activities supporting.
Okay, and one more on learning objective. Can you please provide some examples of how you might personalize a learning objective for students?
I will on the next slide, actually. Or in about 2 slides. Yes, that's coming right up. I promise you I'm getting to that very shortly. Give me about 2 slides and I'll be there. Because this is the next recommendation, connect learning to previous and future learning. So I gave you the example of Math 4.0a. What you might tell students is, remember last year in 3rd grade we did this, next year that'll help you do this. That's sort of a very big picture. It doesn't work all that well, but you can certainly let kids know, remember last week we learned about this. Today, this week the objective is this, And it's going to really help us because next week we're going to go one step further. So it's making that connection. While you and your plan book know this to be true, you've built a sequence, or your district has built a scope and sequence that's logical and builds upon itself, let your kids know that as well so they see the alignment. And now we get to the answer to that question Carolyn just asked me. How do we first of all, do we always have kids personalize their learning objective? No, sometimes there just isn't any way to make it personal. It is what it is, and that's what it has to be. But still, in something like math, I want to be a better math problem solver. At the middle school, I want to know more about linear equations or how to solve linear equations. And I want to do this by working with a partner. I don't work as well alone as I work with a partner, so let me work with a partner. So it's really asking kids within the very strict boundaries of the learning objective itself, is there a piece you want to carve out for yourself? It isn't about kids getting to pick what they learn. Your scope and sequence and your curriculum guide identify that. It's really about, when practical, when possible, how can I personalize this for me? How do I put this in a real world context? How does this thing that I'm learning in math apply in my life outside of this classroom? Or how does this connect to something we're learning in science right now? So it's about building those connections. A couple of things to consider here. This is at the classroom level based on the recommendations. And understand, I'm giving you an hour of what would normally be a day of classroom instruction that works workshops that we would spend a lot of time doing hands-on types of activities. But based on the recommendations, things to consider: do you as a teacher consistently post that learning objective? Do you consistently talk about the learning objective with students? When I go into classrooms for observations and I see the learning objective on the whiteboard, but it's never mentioned to the students, and when I ask kids what they're learning, they look at me like, I don't know what I'm learning, even though it's written right on the whiteboard. That's clear evidence that it's posted because the principal said to post your objectives. What I want to stress with you is the reason you do this is because it helps students. Post the learning objective, visible to students in student-friendly language, and during instruction, make sure that you talk about it. Do you consistently reference the objective throughout the lesson, and do you give students the opportunity to personalize the learning? Make them clear on why they're learning something. And then at the building level or the district level, because remember, this isn't about the convenience of the adult, it's about the benefit for the student. As students go classroom to classroom in your building, is there consistency in posting the learning objective? Is there an expectation that the learning objectives will be posted? Is there consistency in the school on the grain size that is posted? For example, in this classroom, is it a very small learning objective that we're going to cover in 20 minutes, and then I go into my next class and it's a learning objective for the entire year? Let's define in our building what we're going to post as a learning objective, and as a starting point, unit objectives make some sense. Is there consistency in the school in expecting teachers to reference objectives? Has that been made clear to people? It helps kids when you reference the objective during your instruction. And then finally, and again, for the consistency of your students, is there consistency on where the objective is posted? It really doesn't take a whole lot of compromise on the teacher's parts to agree, I'm going to post, as a building, we're going to post learning objectives in the top right-hand corner in every classroom. That doesn't take away a whole lot of academic freedom on the teacher side, but it sure does make things much more transparent for the students. I want to take just a little bit of self-reflection pause now. I threw a lot of stuff at you very quickly, and I understand that. Think about one thing that you want to remember that you're going to try to do differently in your classroom in the next couple of weeks. Remember, one of the objectives that I posted at the very beginning of the session was think about something that you're going to try in your classroom in the next 2 weeks. Think about that now. I'll give you about 30 seconds of self-reflection time. Okay, so hopefully you've come up with at least one thing that you can try differently in your classroom with setting objectives. And now we're going to begin with the next piece of the puzzle, adding and connecting, providing feedback. The graphic on your screen is very intentional. We see these two strategies, categories of strategies, as intimately linked here. I'm back to my visual metaphor of learning pre-K-12 or pre-K-20, and I said in the first time you saw this picture, let's identify that clump of trees as our learning goal, our learning target, our learning objective. So we have that clump of trees as what we've identified in setting objectives. Providing feedback is giving information to our students as how well they're performing relative to that particular learning objective. So I see that clump of trees, I know what I'm supposed to be learning, but if I begin to veer off onto the shoulder or I take that road over on the left side of the screen, the teacher's going to give me feedback to keep me back on the road heading toward the learning objective. This is a picture of John Hattie. John Hattie is a researcher, wrote another book, a good book called Visible Learning, and in there a quote is, "The most powerful single innovation that enhances achievement is feedback. The simplest prescription for improving education must be dollops of feedback." I had to look up dollops to make sure I really understood, and it's small doses repeatedly, giving a lot of feedback to students throughout the learning. Another quick poll. One of the recommendations that you're going to see is feedback should be corrective. Again, this is from one of the rubrics in the Handbook for Classroom Instruction That Works. I would like you to respond on 1 through 4. I seldom provide criteria rubrics prior to the unit study that describes each level of performance. I occasionally give students an opportunity to correct mistakes and redo work. I consistently give my students opportunity to correct mistakes and redo work based on, I consistently, yes, I thought I had a typo there. And then 4 is I consistently give my students an opportunity to correct mistakes or redo work based on feedback, and my students use the feedback I provide to revise their work. So I'm going to ask Carolyn to launch this poll, and we'll give you about a minute to respond. Okay, about another 5 seconds to get your votes in. We're just under 70%. A couple more votes would push us over the edge to 70. You can do it. There you go. All right. Carolyn, if you'll close out the poll, we'll share the results with you. And now you can see the results on your screen. 3% seldom provide rubrics prior to the unit of study, 20% occasionally, a third of you consistently, and 45% of you consistently provide the opportunity for students to correct mistakes and redo work based on feedback. And your students use that feedback. That's a two-part question, by the way, and it's important to see that. Again, this is one of the rows of a rubric on feedback. It's actually a page-and-a-half long rubric just on this particular strategy from Handbook for Classroom Instruction That Works. Classroom recommendations. Again, the objective is to understand the classroom recommendations. Provide feedback that addresses what is correct and elaborate on what a student is supposed to do next. We'll talk a lot about this. Provide feedback in an appropriate time frame to meet students' needs. Provide feedback that is criterion-referenced, and then engage students in the feedback process. So we'll go through each one of these. Let's take a look at Kent's paper. Here's Kent. He's a math student, double-digit multiplication, and this was his homework and/or quiz. You can decide which it is. And based on this feedback, which I would love to say is not typical, but it's way too typical, based on this feedback, I think all that Kent can get out of this is that he's not very good on math, and why bother any longer? I don't get math. It's just not working for me. Now, if you look at the key in the top left, you can see that we're solving by multiplying two digits. That's what this whole piece is about, multiplying two digits by two-digit numbers. The skill is right up there at the top right-hand corner. Some of these, I think Kent can look at problem J and figure out what he did wrong. Problem D, if you don't do it, your odds of getting it correct are pretty slim. But let's look at E. If you look at E, Kent actually did the multiplication correctly. 4 times 52 is 208. But he came up with the wrong answer. I'm not exactly sure how his addition got him to 408, but what I am pretty clear on is he didn't align his columns. And if you look at the example in the box, you're supposed to put a 0 in the ones place for the second number, and Kent didn't do that. And as a result, he didn't have much of a chance of getting the right product. Kent needs to know that, and he needs to know that right now. More importantly, Kent needs to be told, remember, you got to put in the 0. You can't be this sloppy with your answers. Get the columns correct, and then redo this. I want you to redo this paper until correct. Looking at the provide feedback that addresses what is correct and elaborate on what students need to do next. So Kent, I want you to do this paper again. I want you to put the zeros in. I want you to align the columns, and I want you to pay addition to your addition. Because what's going to happen now is without that kind of feedback and the opportunity to correct his paper, Kent's going to get an F, it's going to be put in the grade book, and then we go on to the next activity. And he's going to keep making that mistake over and over again until eventually Kent goes from being a poor math student to a very good discipline problem and a student who is disconnecting from instruction. This is research that we cite in Classroom Instruction That Works, both first and second edition. If you give kids just feedback on the right and wrong answer, pretty much like Kent got here, right, wrong, that actually has, in this particular set of studies, a negative effect size. In other words, student achievement goes down 3 percentile points in standardized achievement. If you simply had given Kent the correct answers, if the teacher had written the correct answers here, at least Kent would have had sort of a little bit of a roadmap, and that does show a positive percentile point gain, 9 percentile points. But if we allow students, give them an explanation and allow them to repeat and correct, you see the huge change now in the percentile points. How allowing kids to give them an explanation of what they did right and what they did wrong and what they need to do next really helps kids to get it. The next recommendation was provide timely feedback. We have our activity, there's a student response, you as the teacher diagnose, and you give them that immediate feedback. Going back to Kent's paper again, if Kent turns in that paper on Monday and he gets it back the following Monday, how many mistakes has he made on that concept in the course of the week? He needs to get that feedback as quickly as possible, act upon that feedback, and begin to master the skill. The faster, the better. Now I'm going to skip that slide and go to this one instead, looking at the clock. I put together just a little schematic of how this might look. So at the top, I've got my activity, my quiz, my whatever it is, and it's either correct response or incorrect response. If it's a correct response, I want to provide recognition and then move them on to the next activity tied to the learning objective. If it's an incorrect response, I want to give them corrective feedback, allow them the opportunity to redo the work, and then go back to the activity itself. So you see a little flow chart here showing the differences. At this point in our face-to-face sessions, this is usually where somebody says, yeah, but how do I grade that? Well, this isn't about the grading, but I will tell you that putting zeros in your gradebook, in fact, I just wrote a blog about this a week ago on the Mccrone website, so if you're interested in adding some conversation to a blog called The Devastating Power of Zero, I may have biased my opinion by the title on that one. Giving kids zeros on assignments is really harmful. It really makes it difficult for a student to be successful when they accumulate a couple of zeros. So what we would suggest is corrective feedback, allow them to redo, and grade them on their achievement. That's a huge can of worms, and I'm not going to go into it in this webinar, but if you'd like to participate in that conversation, you can go to mccrone.org, you'll see our blog, and feel free to voice your opinion there. Provide feedback that is criterion-referenced was the next one of our recommendations. And you see here that when we build a rubric, when most people build rubrics, a 4-point rubric, 3 would be the desired level of performance. A 4 is going above and beyond. It's exemplary performance that exceeds the targeted level. A teacher should be happy on a well-designed rubric if every one of his or her students gets to a 3. The target is not to get everyone to a 4. The target is to get everyone to a 3. We have a sample rubric here for something that I care very deeply about, and that's that perfect cup of coffee. A 3 on the rubric is a large cup of Starbucks blend with caramel syrup served in a ceramic mug by a waiter in the dining room of my favorite restaurant. Where I usually end up is about a 2 on the rubric. A cup of Boyer's, which is a local sort of, well, it's a local brand of coffee, in a paper cup served at my desk by me on a typical day in the office. That's usually where I end up on my rubric. A 1, unacceptable. A cold cup of 2-day-old instant coffee with grounds floating at the top of a styrofoam cup. I've had people ask me, how is it possible to have grounds floating on the top of a cup of instant coffee? And honestly, I don't have an answer to that question. And then finally, a 4 on the rubric. Remember, a 4 exceeds expectations. Is that steaming cup of cafe mocha with fresh whipped cream served in a Royal Belton china cup by an attractive person on the deck of a private yacht off of the coast of Spain? That would be marvelous, but that is not what my expected level of performance is on a day-to-day basis. So build your rubrics that way. But a problem with rubrics for most teachers is they are really a pain to create. Rubrics are tedious and time-consuming. I'm not going to go into a demonstration here of this website, but if you don't know about RubyStar and it's been around since I think 1998. Please take a moment to go to RubyStar. It's a great place to create rubrics, fast and easy. In about 30 seconds, you can create a high-quality rubric on a number of topics. You can also view literally tens of thousands of good rubrics and not so good rubrics on a variety of subjects. And I've had teachers challenge me when we do our technology workshops around classroom instruction that works. Yeah, but I teach ancient art history to juniors in high school. You're not going to find any rubrics on that, are you? And we'll do a search for ancient art history, and sure enough, there's a rubric. Well, but what about something specific to Montana state history? Yeah, okay, there's a rubric there too. So try RubyStar if you're not familiar with this website. It's a great place to begin to use rubrics at a high level. Our next recommendation is engage students in the feedback process. You really want to get kids involved in this process if, as John Hattie says, we should provide kids with dollops of feedback, enormous amounts of feedback. It doesn't need to be by the teachers only. In fact, if you create good rubrics using RubyStar and you teach kids how to use the rubric, then you can have kids begin to use the rubric to provide objective feedback to their peers. It involves you teaching the kids what the rubric really is meant to do, how you're supposed to use the rubric. And a well-designed rubric shows kids where they are and what they need to do to get to the next level. And as a teacher, if you model this a few times in the classroom, then you can go to the students. You know, you show examples on the screen and you go through as a class, how would you score this particular work against this rubric? Then you can have them say, exchange papers, and I want you to look at your partner's paper on just this one row of the rubric and give them feedback on where you see them right now and what they would need to do in your mind to get to the next level. It becomes less than about I like you and I don't like you, and more about here's what your work did and here's what your work needs to do to get to the next level. So engage students in that process. Involve kids in self-assessment. And this is pretty deep level stuff, and you can be doing this at the primary level as well as at the senior level in high school. What was I supposed to accomplish? How hard did I work? What's the best part of what I did? What would I do different next time? What do I need to work on now? I've had people say, yeah, that's fine for older kids, but younger kids, they can't do this. And I will tell you that as an elementary principal, we used student-led conferencing, and that's exactly what we did. And I had kindergartners engaging their parents in very meaningful conversations about here's what I do really well, here's what some other kids in the class do well that I don't do as well, here's what I really want to learn. And parents came away from that student-led conference with almost awe in their minds about their students. They really understood the learning process and they owned it. And it was really, really important. So get kids involved in that self-assessment. Some think questions, and then we're going to go into questions open to the group here now. Feedback is important. John Hattie said dollops of feedback. Classroom Instruction That Works has 4 really strong recommendations. How do you teach students to use and, more importantly, to provide feedback? How do you give your students opportunities for self-assessment to become that reflective learner we would all like to have? How do you give students opportunities for peer assessment? What protocols or tools do you give them so that they can be objective? And then, what might you do differently in these processes? So my last slide, and then I'll turn it over to Carolyn for questions. Again, in our, I think I have, well, I will in a moment. In our learning objectives, what are you going to do differently in the next 2 weeks? This is that time to think about it. What are you going to do differently in the next couple of weeks? I've mentioned 3 books. I'll bring them up on the screen while you're thinking. Classroom Instruction That Works, second edition. If the book you have is not blue on the cover, you don't have the newest edition. I think ASCD would join me in encouraging you to go ahead and get that second edition of the book because it is much different in its nature than the first edition. I've mentioned a number of times the Handbook for Classroom Instruction That Works. What we try to do in the Handbook is write from the teacher's voice, really thinking about classroom scenarios. We have probably 40 vignettes in the book of what it's like in the classroom to use these strategies either singly or together. We also have those teacher rubrics and student checklists. And then the third in this series, all of these came out just last year using technology with Classroom Instruction That Works. Again, if your copy of this does not look like this, you have the first edition. And this talks about the technologies that enhance quality instruction. I've got this for more information screen up here. Please feel very free to send me emails at that address. I'll be glad to answer those, and I'll get those answered quickly within 24 hours for you. And with that, Carolyn, I'm going to turn it over to you for any questions or summation at the end.
Okay. We have a question. If you haven't discussed classroom instruction that works at all with your staff, where would you start?
Well, you got to begin at the beginning, and I think it's really important. We believe that the strategy that really is the place to start is setting objectives. And so start with a clear understanding, purchase the book or the handbook or both, and give teachers that, not only give teachers, but come up with a unified understanding as a staff. This is the importance of setting objectives. Put clear, measurable learning objectives on the whiteboard, visible to students. Understand that the expectation is this is going to be done, and I'm going to be coming in the class, and I expect to see it, and your students should expect to see it. I'll tell you a quick story on this one in the time we have. I was doing this work in a school, and I'd been with them for a number of visits, and I could tell there was this one teacher that was sort of wasn't buying into this whole setting objective thing. And so I was working with administrators in that building, and on a break I went over to her room just to see how it was going, fourth grade teacher. And I caught her just as her kids were coming in from their lunch recess, and she hadn't had time to put her learning objective up on the whiteboard. Now this is a teacher who had been putting a learning objective on the whiteboard. It wasn't even in student-friendly language, but she was doing it because the principal said, I'm going to be checking this. So she was complying with a rule. But I was talking with her in the hallway, and she didn't get her afternoon learning objective on the whiteboard, and this little girl came walking in between us, went into the room, and immediately turned around and came back out, and she said, Teacher, aren't we going to learn anything this afternoon? And the teacher all of a sudden had that aha moment. Even though she hadn't been emphasizing learning objectives in her classroom with her kids, this little girl needed to see it. And when she walked in and didn't see it and came back out and said, aren't we going to learn anything, I had an automatic and instant disciple to Classroom Instruction That Works. So I would start with setting objectives. It's, I think, the foundational of all the strategies. The four authors agree with that. That's where I would start.
Okay. Given that the Common Core state standards are requiring higher levels of thinking and verbalizing answers, how or what strategies help to create a risk-taking environment?
Well, that's two questions there. I'll start with what I thought was going to be the easy question. What strategies help us get to those higher levels? And that's going to be in our next session when we talk about asking analytic and inferential questions and those types of things. Creating that risk-taking environment, though, is really in this piece. That's giving kids that fair feedback and allowing them to be successful. If I know that I'm not going to be punished, if I'm going to be held harmless for making mistakes and allowed to fix those mistakes, I am much more likely to take risks. Going back to that math paper I showed you from Kent, Kent's not going to be a risk taker in that classroom. But if Kent knows that one try is not all I get. I can keep working at it, and I can learn to master the content, and my teacher's going to support me. That's when you're going to get kids willing to take those risks.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about feedback. Is going over the correct answers to a homework assignment the next day in class the same as correcting it on the paper in terms of
yes,
feedback?
to a degree. Yeah. What has to happen is kids need to get feedback. The important part, however you deliver the message, is what did I do right, what did I do wrong, and what do I need to do next. So if you simply read the correct answers on the screen, you know, the kids take a quiz and the next day you go through the answer number 1 with 7 number. You know, if you simply do that, that's the beginning part. But what do you need to do next? Where's that opportunity to redo and show my mastery of the content?
Okay. Is there a time frame for feedback given timetable constraints? Can feedback be given as follow-up activities?
The answer to that actually is based on some research that says yes. Feedback within 24 hours is excellent. Feedback within 48 hours is also good. But as you will see, and it's in the first edition, I think also in the second edition of Classroom Instruction That Works, once we get past 48 hours, that's where we said use timely feedback. It was actually that slide that I skipped. So you have it in your handouts, the slide that I skipped. After 48 hours, there's a pretty big drop-off. And I'll go back to Kent's paper again. You can see how that would be. If Kent doesn't get feedback to his math mistakes within 48 hours, he's compounded those errors 3 or 4 times. So feedback should be quick and timely. I think rather than judging it by a clock, judge it by the word timely. Give kids feedback so that they have time to correct their mistake before you add the next skill on top of it.
Okay. What are your suggestions for providing feedback on complex writing tasks where students are developing several, looks like, I think she means elements of writing?
In any type of procedural knowledge, in writing, the writing process is procedural knowledge, you need to give kids feedback on what they did right and wrong in each part of the process and then how the process fits together. In the Handbook for Classroom Instruction That Works, I wrote a little story about teaching my daughter to ride a 2-wheel bike, and it maps very nicely onto the writing process. I taught her each individual step, steering, braking, balancing, all those things, and she wasn't 100% proficient on each one of those as she began to put them together. And she got the feedback throughout the process. Remember, you're steering too sharply. Remember, you're doing this. I gave her feedback on each part of the process, but I also then gave her feedback on the outcome itself, which was the end product. So you want to provide feedback on each piece of the process and then feedback on the overall work and how the pieces fit together. I hope that answered that question.
Okay, and because of time, and I still have some ASCD stuff to do, we have time for one last question, and it's about the books. And the question is, do I need the book if I have the handbook?
Well,
ASCD would say, yes, you need both.
I knew that was the answer. And I'll go back to the books here. All 3 of the books build on the same pieces of knowledge. The handbook and the technology book include the recommendations. They have different emphasis. So in Classroom Instruction That Works, we're talking about the strategies themselves and the importance of the classroom recommendations. In the Handbook for Classroom Instruction That Works, we're focusing on vignettes showing teacher experiences. And in using technology with Classroom Instruction That Works, we've assumed you've read the Classroom Instruction That Works. We say, here are the recommendations and here's how technology enhances those recommendations. So it's what focus you want to bring to it. The blue book on your screen right now I believe is something you should start with. If your budget only allowed you to buy one book, that would probably be it. But I'd strongly suggest that at least you have 1 or 2 copies of the other 2 books in your building, because you're going to have some teachers who come in and say, you know, classroom instruction that works, I'm an expert there already. And I understand I read the new book, I understand the planning framework, it makes perfect sense to me. I've been doing this very well in my classroom. I want to look at the technology components. Or someone else says, I read the book and I really want to try to visualize this. The handbook's going to help you visualize it. They serve 3 different purposes.
Okay, and I am going to thank you for responding to all of those questions, and I'm going to further promote the book. You can purchase Classroom Instruction That Works and the other Classroom Instruction That Work titles, and there's a DVD as well, which we didn't mention, in the ASCD store. The URL is shop.ascd.org. If you go to that to our store, you will be able to type in Classroom Instruction That Works, and every title and DVD that we have on the subject will be available to you. So please, we encourage you, of course, to go get that title. This presentation will be archived at the URL that you see on your screen. This is the first of 4 Classroom Instruction That Works webinars, and once the archives are completed, we will put them on this page for you to view and share with your colleagues. And as I just mentioned, this is the first of 4, and if you go to this website, you'll see all of the sessions that we have coming up in April and May, along with a description, and we encourage you to sign up now if you can, because we have a space limit and the other 3 sessions are filling up quickly. So we encourage you to register for those sessions today. Our next webinar is tomorrow, April 9th, Minding the Achievement Gap, One Classroom at a Time, Tips for EL and Special Education Teachers with Jane Pollock. We encourage you to sign up for that. You can also check out our webinar series on the Common Core. You can view and register for those sessions at www.ascd.org/Common Core webinars. Thank you, Howard, for your wonderful presentation. I thank the audience for joining us today, and we will see you next time.